Introduction. A surgery no one survived. Welcome to the Story Vault, Buried Truths, a place where forgotten history, strange true events, and the darker corners of the past are uncovered and brought back into the light. Some of the stories inside this vault are unsettling, some are mysterious, and some sound almost impossible, yet they really happened. So whether you're returning to the vault or unlocking it for the first time, settle in, because tonight's story takes us back to a time when surgery was as terrifying as the illness itself, and when one operation would become one of the strangest legends in medical history. A surgery remembered for something almost impossible, a mortality rate of 300%. Before modern hospitals, before sterile gloves, before bright operating lights and quiet machines that monitor every heartbeat, surgery was something else entirely. Now, let us begin. Before modern hospitals, before sterile gloves, before bright operating lights and quiet machines that monitor every heartbeat, surgery was something else entirely. It was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. There were no gentle sedatives to carry a patient into sleep, no antibiotics waiting quietly in the wings to stop infection, no antiseptic smell of clean alcohol in the air. Instead, there were wooden tables, blood-stained coats, iron tools, and a room filled with witnesses. Because in the early 1800s, surgery was not hidden behind closed doors. It was performed in front of crowds. Students packed into steep wooden galleries. Doctors leaned over railings. Spectators sometimes even paid to watch. An operating room was less like the quiet surgical suites we imagine today, and more like a theater, a place where pain was loud, where fear was visible, and where the outcome was never guaranteed. The patient would be carried into the room fully conscious, fully aware, sometimes already screaming. They would be held down by assistants, their limbs pinned to the table as tightly as possible, because once the knife touched skin, there was no turning back. And the only mercy a surgeon could offer was speed. The faster the blade moved, the sooner the agony might end. Some surgeons built entire reputations on this single skill: speed, the fastest hands, the quickest knife, the boldest cuts. And among those surgeons, one man stood above the rest, a towering figure in the surgical world of 19th century London, a man whose operations drew crowds the way famous performers filled theaters. Students whispered his name, patients feared it, and fellow surgeons respected it. Robert Liston. He was known as the fastest surgeon in Europe, a man who could remove a leg in less than half a minute. His blade moved with such speed that witnesses described it as a flash of steel. In an age when pain ruled the operating table, speed meant survival, and survival meant fame. But speed also meant risk, because the faster the knife, the less room there was for error. And on one unforgettable day, inside a crowded surgical theater, that risk would turn into one of the most bizarre disasters in medical history. An operation so chaotic, so horrifying, that it would later be remembered for something almost impossible. Not 100% mortality rate, not even 200%, but 300%. One operation, 3 deaths. A patient, an assistant, and a man who wasn't even part of the surgery. Historians still debate the exact details. Some say the story has been exaggerated over time. Others insist it really happened. But whether every detail is true or not, The legend has survived for nearly 2 centuries, whispered through medical schools, repeated in history books, and retold as one of the strangest cautionary tales medicine has ever produced. Tonight, inside the Story Vault Buried Truths, we're opening that legend. The story of the surgeon whose knife moved so fast it created the deadliest operation ever recorded. But before we begin, if you enjoyed dark history, forgotten mysteries, and strange true stories buried deep in the past, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories from the Story Vault Buried Truths. Because inside this vault, there are countless stories history tried to forget. And tonight, we unlock one of the most unbelievable. So settle in, lower the lights, and imagine yourself standing in a crowded operating theater, London, early 1800s. The room is packed. The patient lies waiting. The surgeon lifts his knife, and just before the blade begins its work, he turns to the crowd and says 4 chilling words. "Time me, gentlemen." And with that, the operation begins. Chapter 1. Surgery Before Safety. To understand how a single operation could end with 3 deaths, we first have to step into a world where surgery itself was already a gamble with death. A time before safety, before sterile rooms, before the quiet hum of machines and the careful choreography of modern medicine. Because if you walked into a surgical theater in the early 19th century, you would not recognize it as a hospital at all. You would think you had stepped into something closer to a battlefield, or perhaps a butcher's shop. The air inside these rooms was thick, heavy, not just with tension, but with smell. The sharp iron scent of fresh blood, the sour odor of sweat from men packed tightly together in warm galleries, and underneath it all, the faint, sickly sweetness of infection. But the people gathered there did not yet understand what caused that smell. They had no concept of microscopic organisms floating invisibly through the air, no knowledge of bacteria silently invading open wounds. The word germ had not yet entered the language of medicine. Instead, doctors believed illness came from something they called miasma, bad air, invisible vapors rising from filth, decay, or crowded cities. If a patient died after surgery, it was blamed on weakness of the body, or fate, or simply bad luck. Rarely the surgeon, rarely the tools, and almost never the room itself. Because the room itself was rarely clean. The surgical theater of the early 1800s was a place of spectacle. Wooden benches rose in steep rows round a central operating table. Students crowded shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks for a better view. Some leaned so far forward they nearly hung over the railings. Others scribbled frantic notes while trying not to look away. Because surgery was both horrifying and mesmerizing. At the center of the room stood the operating table, often nothing more than a thick wooden plank. No cushioning, no sterile sheets, no adjustable lighting, just a table and the patient, fully awake, fully aware, waiting for the knife. There was no anesthesia yet, no ether drifting softly through a mask, no gentle countdown as consciousness faded away. That breakthrough would not arrive until the 1840s. Before then, surgery meant something brutal and immediate. Pain was unavoidable, absolute, and often overwhelming. Patients sometimes screamed so loudly that their voices echoed through hospital corridors. Others begged doctors to stop. A few simply went into shock. Not from blood loss, but from the unbearable agony itself. Because when the knife touched skin, there was nothing to dull the sensation. Muscle, nerve, bone, every layer of the body felt the blade. Which is why surgeons of this era developed a skill that might sound strange to modern ears: speed. Not precision, not delicacy, speed. The faster the operation, the shorter the suffering, and perhaps the greater the chance the patient might survive the shock. Some surgeons practiced their movements like athletes, rehearsing every motion of the knife, every turn of the wrist, every cut. Their goal was simple: finish the operation before the patient could die from the pain alone. Assistants played a critical role in these procedures. 2 or 3 strong men would hold the patient firmly against the table, one gripping the shoulders, another pinning down the legs. Sometimes straps were used, sometimes leather restraints, and sometimes the only thing keeping a patient still was sheer exhaustion. The surgeon would step forward only when everything was ready. Instruments laid out, assistants positioned, spectators watching, and then the cutting would begin. The tools themselves were simple, crude by modern standards: long steel knives, bone saws, forceps, clamps. Most of them reused countless times without proper cleaning. Between operations, instruments might be wiped on a cloth or rinsed briefly in water, but true sterilization did not exist. Many surgeons even carried their instruments in leather cases stained with dried blood from previous procedures. At the time, this was not considered careless. In fact, many doctors believed exposure to previous surgical blood somehow proved the reliability of their tools. It was a strange mixture of confidence and ignorance. They had mastered the visible dangers of surgery, but the invisible ones remained hidden. And those invisible dangers were the true killers. Because even if a patient survived the knife, even if the operation itself went perfectly, the real battle often began afterward. In the days following surgery, many patients developed something doctors called hospital gangrene. The wound would begin to swell. Skin around the incision darkened. A foul smell filled the room, and soon fever would set in. Doctors had no effective way to stop it. No antibiotics. No antiseptics. Once infection took hold, death often followed. In some hospitals, more than half of surgical patients died after otherwise successful procedures. It was a grim reality doctors tried not to dwell on. Instead, they focused on what they could control: the knife, the speed, the skill of the operation itself. Which meant surgeons were judged by something unusual. Not by how many patients survived afterward, but by how impressively they performed during the procedure. And in this strange environment, surgery became something almost theatrical. Crowds gathered, students whispered excitedly, assistants prepared like stagehands before a performance. The surgeon was the central figure, part physician, part craftsman, part performer. And the greatest performers developed reputations that spread across cities. People spoke of certain surgeons the way audiences spoke of famous actors. They told stories about impossible operations, about blades that moved faster than the eye could follow. about amputations completed before a patient had time to fully scream. And among all those surgeons, one name became legendary: Robert Liston. A man whose speed was so extraordinary that witnesses struggled to describe it. Tall and imposing, Liston commanded attention the moment he entered the operating theater. He stood well over 6 feet tall, an intimidating presence in a time when most men were considerably shorter. His voice carried easily across crowded rooms. His movements were confident, direct, almost aggressive. Students who watched him operate often described the experience as electrifying. Because when Liston worked, he did not hesitate. He did not pause. He moved with a kind of surgical momentum that left spectators breathless. Assistants had to move quickly just to keep up with him. One moment the patient lay waiting, and seconds later the operation was already underway. Liston specialized in amputations, one of the most common and necessary procedures of the time. Industrial accidents were frequent, factories were dangerous, farming equipment could maim in an instant, and infections from minor injuries often spread rapidly through limbs. When that happened, amputation was often the only chance for survival. But amputations were brutal. The surgeon had to cut through muscle, tissue, and skin before sawing through bone, all while the patient remained conscious. Every second mattered, and that was where Liston excelled. He was astonishingly fast. Witnesses claimed he could remove a leg in under 30 seconds. Some even suggested he did it faster. Students watching from the gallery sometimes pulled out pocket watches to time him, and Liston encouraged it, because he understood something about human nature. Speed impressed people. Speed created legend. Before beginning some operations, Liston reportedly turned toward the crowded gallery and announced a phrase that would become famous in medical history. "Time me, gentlemen." The words were both a challenge and a warning, because once the knife began to move, everything happened quickly. Too quickly for hesitation, too quickly for mistakes. Or at least, that was the hope. But speed can be a dangerous ally, because when every movement is rushed, even the smallest error can become catastrophic. And on one unforgettable day, inside a crowded surgical theater filled with eager spectators, Robert Liston's legendary speed would lead to a moment that would echo through medical history. And operations so chaotic, so shocking, that it would later become one of the strangest stories ever told about a surgeon. A story that would earn a dark, almost unbelievable description. The only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. But that story is only just beginning. Chapter 2: The Fastest Knife in London. In the early decades of the 19th century, London was a city alive with noise, smoke, and restless ambition. The streets were crowded with carts and horses, factories rattled with iron machines, ship masts filled the skyline along the River Thames. It was an age of industry and invention, but it was also an age of danger. Workplaces were brutal, machinery was unforgiving, streets were chaotic, and hospitals filled quickly with those who had been crushed, mangled, or infected by the hazards of daily life. Among the most common sights in medical wards were patients whose injuries had become too severe to save. A shattered leg from a carriage accident, a hand destroyed in factory gears, a deep wound that had turned black with infection. When damage spread through a limb, doctors often had only one option left: amputation. Today, the word sounds clinical, controlled, almost routine. But 2 centuries ago, an amputation was something closer to a violent race against death. There was no anesthesia to dull the pain, no antibiotics to stop infection, and very little time to act. Once the decision was made, the surgeon had to move quickly. The faster the limb was removed, the greater the chance the patient might survive the trauma. Speed was not just admired, it was essential. And no surgeon in Britain embodied that philosophy more completely than Robert Liston. Liston was born in Scotland in 1794, during a time when medical training was still evolving into something resembling modern science. From an early age, he displayed a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of determination. But it was not just intelligence that set him apart. It was presence. When Liston entered a room, people noticed. He stood well over 6 feet tall, towering above many of his contemporaries. His frame was broad and powerful, giving him the appearance of someone built for physical work rather than quiet scholarship. His voice carried authority, his movements carried purpose, and his confidence was unmistakable. Some described him as brilliant. Others described him as intimidating. Many agreed he was both. Liston trained in Edinburgh, one of the great centers of medical education at the time. The city's medical school attracted students from across Europe, eager to learn the newest surgical techniques. But even among skilled instructors and ambitious trainees, Liston quickly distinguished himself, not just for his knowledge, but for the speed of his hands. Surgery in that era required physical strength and precision. Cutting through muscle and tissue demanded steady control. Sawing through bone required force. But above all, surgeons needed to work quickly. Every moment of agony increased the risk that the patient would collapse from shock, and Liston moved faster than anyone. Witnesses often struggled to describe it. Some said his knife flashed like lightning. Others said watching him operate felt like watching a magician perform a trick too fast to fully understand. Students crowded into operating theaters whenever Liston was scheduled to perform surgery. Word spread quickly through medical circles. If you wanted to see the fastest surgeon in Britain, you watched Robert Liston. The surgical theater itself was designed almost like a stage. At the center stood the operating table. Above it, rising in curved rows, were wooden benches filled with observers. Students, doctors, and visiting surgeons leaned forward to watch every movement. Some clutched notebooks. Others simply stared, trying to memorize the choreography of the procedure. Because that was what surgery had become, a kind of brutal choreography. Assistants held the patient down. Instruments were passed quickly from hand to hand, and the surgeon directed the entire scene. When Liston stepped forward to begin an operation, the atmosphere in the room often shifted immediately. Conversations quieted. Students leaned closer. Everyone understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. Liston wasted little time with preparation. He believed hesitation created danger. The longer a patient waited, the greater the fear, the greater the pain once the knife began its work. So Liston moved decisively. His instruments were arranged within reach. His assistants stood ready. And before beginning, he often turned toward the audience with a statement that became legendary. "Time me, gentlemen." The phrase carried a strange mixture of pride and practicality. It was partly a challenge, partly a demonstration, and partly a promise, because Liston intended to finish the operation faster than anyone else possibly could. When the cutting began, the room erupted into controlled chaos. The patient would scream, assistants would tighten their grip, and Liston's knife moved in swift, confident strokes. Skin first, then muscle, the blade slicing deeper with every motion. Blood flowed freely, often soaking the wooden floor beneath the table. But Liston did not slow down. He cut with extraordinary speed, separating tissue in broad strokes. Within seconds, the bone would be exposed. At that moment, an assistant handed him the surgical saw. The sound that followed was one students never forgot. A harsh, grinding rasp as steel teeth bit into bone. The noise echoed through the theater like a carpenter cutting through timber. It was one of the most unsettling sounds in medicine. But again, speed mattered. Liston sawed quickly, finishing the task in seconds rather than minutes. Once the limb was removed, he moved immediately to tie off arteries and close the wound. The entire operation might last less than half a minute. To modern ears, that speed sounds reckless, but to patients in that era, it was a blessing. Every second saved meant less time enduring unbearable pain. And every second saved meant a slightly greater chance of survival. Because even if the operation itself went well, the patient's fate remained uncertain. Blood loss, shock, and infection could still claim their life in the days ahead. But in the moment itself, Liston's speed gave people hope. Stories about his abilities spread quickly across Britain. Doctors repeated them. Students told them to new classes of trainees. Patients sometimes requested Liston by name. And with fame came legend. One famous story claimed Liston once completed an amputation so quickly that a student fainted before the operation had even finished. Another described him finishing a procedure before an observer could finish counting aloud. Whether every story was true hardly mattered. They contributed to an image that was growing larger with each passing year. Robert Liston was becoming something more than a surgeon. He was becoming a symbol of surgical mastery. A man who seemed capable of conquering the brutal realities of pre-anesthetic medicine through sheer speed and confidence. But not everyone admired his approach. Some surgeons believed Liston relied too heavily on speed. They worried that such rapid movements left little room for caution. One slip of the blade, one miscalculation, and the consequences could be devastating. In surgery, as in any craft involving sharp instruments and fragile human lives, control mattered just as much as speed. And the faster someone worked, the less time there was to correct a mistake. But Liston believed his skill made mistakes unlikely. His reputation had been built on hundreds of successful procedures. He had saved countless lives through amputations that might otherwise have ended in slow, painful death from infection. To him, speed was not recklessness, it was mercy. Still, even the most confident surgeon cannot control everything. Operating theaters were crowded, assistants were human, patients sometimes struggled violently during procedures, and tools were sharp, unforgiving instruments. In such an environment, the margin for error was thin. very thin. And on one particular day, inside a crowded operating theater filled with students eager to witness another demonstration of Liston's legendary speed, that margin would vanish entirely. The room was packed. The patient was ready. Assistants stood close by. Liston stepped forward with knife in hand. The spectators leaned in, and once again the surgeon addressed the room with the words they had come to expect. "Time me, gentlemen." What happened next would become one of the strangest and most infamous moments in the history of surgery. An operation so disastrous, so shocking, that it would echo through medical history for generations. The story of the only surgery ever said to have achieved something almost impossible, a mortality rate of 300%. But to understand how that could happen, we must step closer to the operating table, closer to the moment when speed and fate collided, and the blade moved just a little too fast. Chapter 3: The Operation That Went Wrong. The operating theater was already full long before the surgery began. Word had spread quickly through the hospital corridors. Robert Liston was performing an amputation. Students had gathered early, climbing the wooden steps of the gallery and settling into their places along the curved benches that overlooked the operating table below. Some leaned forward eagerly. Others whispered quietly to one another, exchanging stories about the legendary surgeon they had come to watch. Many had heard the stories already. The lightning-fast amputations, the knife that moved faster than the eye could follow, the famous phrase that always came just before the blade began its work. For many young medical students, watching Liston operate was considered a rite of passage, a moment they would remember for the rest of their careers. But there was another reason the room felt crowded that day: curiosity. Because every operation performed by Liston carried a certain electricity, something unpredictable, something almost theatrical. The operating theater itself resembled a small arena. At the center stood the table, a thick wooden surface darkened by years of use. The floor beneath it showed stains that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. Around the table stood assistants, their sleeves rolled up, preparing instruments for the procedure. Steel tools lay arranged on a nearby tray: knives, forceps, clamps, and the most unsettling instrument of all, the bone saw. Each tool gleamed faintly under the dim light filtering through high windows. There were no bright surgical lamps, no spotless white walls, only shadows, wood, and the quiet anticipation of the crowd. Then the patient was brought into the room. Two orderlies guided him forward carefully. He was pale, exhausted, and clearly terrified. His leg had been severely injured. Accounts differ on exactly how, but it was the kind of damage doctors of the era recognized immediately. The limb could not be saved. Infection was likely already spreading. Even with the surgery, survival was far from guaranteed. The patient was helped onto the table. Assistants moved quickly, positioning him flat on his back. Another assistant prepared straps to secure his body. It was not cruelty, it was necessity. Because when the knife touched skin, pain would explode through the body like fire, and without restraint, the patient might thrash violently. That kind of movement could turn an already dangerous procedure into complete chaos. So the assistants tightened their grip. One positioned himself near the patient's shoulders, another near the injured leg. Their job was simple: hold the patient still, no matter what happened. Around them, the gallery of students watched silently. Some had seen surgeries before. Others were witnessing their first. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel. Then the doors at the side of the theater opened. Robert Liston entered. He moved with calm confidence, the kind that comes from years of experience and hundreds of successful procedures. His tall figure immediately drew attention. Conversations faded. Students leaned forward. Assistants straightened their posture. Liston approached the table and examined the injured limb briefly. His expression remained calm, focused. He had seen injuries like this many times before. For him, the procedure was familiar, routine, brutal, but familiar. An assistant handed him his surgical knife. The blade was long and sharp, designed to cut cleanly through muscle and tissue. Liston held it comfortably, like a craftsman holding a well-used tool. He glanced toward the crowded gallery, and then he said the words that had become part of surgical legend. "Time me, gentlemen." The phrase carried across the room. Several students instinctively reached for their pocket watches. Others simply held their breath, because once those words were spoken, everything would move quickly, very quickly. The assistants tightened their grip on the patient. The man on the table began to panic. He knew what was coming. Even if he had never seen an amputation before, he understood the reality of it. There would be no anesthesia, no relief, only the knife. Liston raised the blade, and the operation began. The first cut was swift, a long incision through skin and muscle. The patient screamed immediately, the sound echoing through the wooden chamber. Assistants held him firmly as his body strained against the restraints. Liston continued cutting. His movements were fast, practiced, confident. Students leaned forward, trying to follow the motion of the blade. Muscles separated, blood spilled across the table, but everything was proceeding as expected, until it wasn't. In the blur of motion, in the speed that had made Liston famous, something went wrong. As Liston swept the knife through the tissue surrounding the limb, his blade moved dangerously close to one of his assistants. The man was leaning in, gripping the patient's leg tightly to keep it still, and before anyone could react, the knife slipped. Steel met flesh, not the patient's, the assistant's. The blade sliced cleanly across the man's hand, severing several of his fingers in a single motion. For a moment, no one seemed to understand what had happened. Then the assistant screamed, a sharp, shocked cry that cut through the room. Blood sprayed across the operating area. Assistants recoiled. Some gasped. Others stared in stunned silence. But the surgery was still underway. Liston could not stop. Not yet. The patient was still on the table. The limb was not yet removed. So, despite the chaos, despite the assistant staggering backward clutching his injured hand, Liston continued. He moved even faster now. The operation had to finish quickly. He sliced through the remaining muscle. An assistant passed him the saw, and the harsh sound of steel grinding through bone filled the theater. The noise echoed against the wooden walls. The patient's screams mixed with the rasping sound of the saw. Seconds later, the limb was free. Liston moved quickly to tie off arteries and control the bleeding. The amputation was complete, but the room had already descended into confusion. The injured assistant had collapsed against a nearby wall. Blood poured from his mutilated hand. Students shifted uneasily in their seats, and somewhere near the edge of the operating area, another figure suddenly collapsed. An elderly spectator who had been standing near the table had witnessed the accident. He had seen the blade flash, seen the blood spray, and in that moment of chaos, he believed the knife had struck him too. Overcome with terror, the man fainted immediately. His body crumpled to the floor. For a few seconds, the entire theater seemed frozen. 3 men now lay injured or unconscious in the room. The patient on the table, the assistant bleeding from his hand, and the spectator collapsed nearby. The operation had lasted less than a minute, but its consequences were only beginning. Because surgery in the early 19th century did not end when the knife was set down. In many ways, that was when the real danger began. The patient's wound would soon face the invisible enemies doctors still did not understand: bacteria, infection, and the slow, creeping spread of disease through damaged tissue. The assistant's severed fingers carried the same risk. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, even small wounds could become fatal. And the frightened spectator who had fainted, his fate would prove even stranger. In the days that followed, the results of that single operation would ripple outward in ways no one in the room could have predicted. 3 men, 3 different paths, but all connected to the same moment, the same flash of steel, the same surgery. And before the story was finished, the operation would earn a grim reputation that has echoed through medical history ever since. The surgery that achieved something almost impossible: a mortality rate of 300%. But to understand how that could happen, we must look at what came next, because the true tragedy of this story did not unfold in the operating room. It unfolded in the days that followed, when the silent killers of 19th century medicine began their work. Chapter 4: Panic in the Operating Theater. For a few long seconds after the operation ended, the room stood frozen. The sound of the bone saw had stopped. The knife had been set aside, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that came before it. Students in the gallery stared down at the operating floor, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The moment had happened too quickly. One instant the surgery was underway. The next, blood had sprayed across the room, an assistant was screaming, and a spectator had collapsed. And yet, despite the chaos, the surgeon had continued, because that was the brutal reality of 19th century surgery. Once the knife had begun its work, stopping was rarely an option. Now the operation was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. On the operating table, the patient lay trembling. His leg had been removed in less than half a minute, but the trauma of the procedure was immense. His breathing came in ragged bursts. His face had drained of color. Assistants quickly wrapped the wound with thick cloth bandages, tying them tightly to slow the bleeding. In the early 1800s, controlling blood loss was one of the greatest challenges surgeons faced. Arteries had to be tied off by hand. Every second mattered. Too much blood lost in those first minutes could mean death before the patient even left the room. So the staff moved quickly. Cloth, pressure, more cloth, all while trying to stabilize a man whose body had just endured unimaginable pain. Nearby, the injured assistant slumped against the wall. His hand was wrapped in a rough cloth already soaked through with dark red blood. Where his fingers had once been, there was now only a jagged, mutilated wound. The surgical knife had sliced through them in a single terrible motion. Accidents in the operating theater were not unheard of, but this one had been especially shocking because the blade moved with such speed and such force. Students watching from above could still see the trail of blood across the floor where the assistant had stumbled backward. Another surgeon hurried to his side. The wound was severe. Without modern surgical repair, severed fingers could rarely be reattached. The best they could do was stop the bleeding and hope the injury did not become infected. But infection was a constant shadow hanging over every hospital in that era. The doctors in the room knew that even a small wound could become fatal within days. Still, there was yet another figure lying on the floor, the elderly spectator. Moments earlier, he had been standing only a few feet away from the operating table, watching, observing, perhaps trying to see what medical students saw. But when the accident happened, when the blade flashed and blood splattered into the air, the shock had overwhelmed him. The man had collapsed instantly. Now 2 hospital staff members knelt beside him, checking for signs of life. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. Someone called for water. Another suggested carrying him outside for fresh air. The theater, once filled with curiosity and excitement, had transformed into something very different. Confusion, fear, and the unsettling realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Up in the gallery, the students were whispering. Some spoke in hushed voices. Others simply stared down at the scene, trying to process what they had witnessed. Because medical training in that era was not sheltered. Students were exposed to the harsh realities of surgery from the very beginning. They had seen pain, blood, even death. But this was something else. The accident had shattered the illusion of control that surgeons tried to maintain in the operating theater. It reminded everyone present of a truth that was impossible to ignore. Surgery in the early 19th century was dangerous not only for the patient, but for everyone involved. The operating room itself was a place of risk. Sharp blades moved quickly. Assistants worked close to the surgeon's hands. Patients struggled violently under unbearable pain. In such conditions, even a small mistake could lead to catastrophe. And today, that mistake had already injured 2 people, perhaps 3. At the center of the room, Robert Liston stood silently for a moment. The famous surgeon whose speed had filled this theater with admiration only minutes earlier. His expression remained composed, but the accident had not gone unnoticed. He understood what had happened, and he understood what it might mean. In the world of surgery, reputation mattered. Speed made him famous. But accidents could spread through medical circles just as quickly as success. Still, Liston was not a man easily shaken. He had built his career on confidence, on decisive action, And even now, he focused on the immediate priorities. The patient needed stabilization, the assistant needed treatment, and the unconscious spectator had to be moved from the room. Within minutes, hospital staff began guiding people out of the theater. Some students lingered, hoping to learn something from the aftermath. Others left quietly, unsettled by what they had just witnessed. Because even though surgery in that era was brutal, moments like this were rare. Rare enough to become stories, stories that students would repeat years later in distant hospitals, stories that would grow with each retelling. But at that moment, no one in the room was thinking about legends. They were thinking about survival. The patient was carefully lifted from the table and placed onto a stretcher. His breathing remained uneven. Shock was always a threat after amputations. Without anesthesia, the body sometimes reacted violently to the trauma. Some patients survived the operation itself only to die hours later from exhaustion or internal collapse. The hospital staff carried him toward a recovery ward where they would watch closely for signs of improvement or decline. Meanwhile, the injured assistant was escorted away as well. His hand had been tightly wrapped in cloth, but the wound beneath was severe. Without proper surgical repair or sterilization, injuries like this often led to infection, and infection in 19th century hospitals was often a death sentence. As the assistant disappeared through the doorway, some of the remaining students exchanged uneasy glances. They understood the danger. Everyone in medical training knew the reputation of hospital infections. There was even a name whispered in surgical wards: hospital gangrene, a terrifying condition that could spread rapidly through wounded tissue. Once it began, it was almost impossible to stop. Finally, the unconscious spectator was carried out as well. By now, his breathing had steadied slightly, but his face remained pale. Those who helped him assumed he had simply fainted from the shock of witnessing the operation. It was not uncommon. Many first-time observers collapsed during surgeries. The sight of blood, the sound of the saw, the screams of the patient. For some people, it was too much. They expected the man would recover quickly once he regained consciousness. At least, that was the hope. Gradually, the theater began to empty. Students filtered out into the corridors, their conversations quiet and thoughtful. Some discussed the accident in clinical terms. Others spoke with a mixture of awe and unease. Because despite the chaos, one fact remained undeniable. Robert Liston had still completed the amputation in remarkable time. Even with the accident, the operation had taken less than a minute. But something about the event lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it, an unsettling feeling, a sense that the story was not over. And they were right, because the most tragic part of this story would not happen inside the operating theater. It would happen afterward. In the days that followed, days when wounds began to change, when fevers appeared, when infections spread silently through damaged flesh. The knife had done its work, but the invisible dangers of 19th century medicine were only beginning their own. And by the time those dangers finished their work, one surgery would be remembered for something almost impossible. 3 deaths from a single operation. A statistic so strange that generations of doctors would repeat it in disbelief. The surgery with a 300% mortality rate. But the truth behind that number was darker than anyone in the theater could have imagined. Because in the world of early medicine, The blade was often only the beginning of the danger. Chapter 5. Infection, the silent killer. The surgery was over. The blade had done its work. The patient had been carried away from the operating theater. The injured assistant had been escorted to another ward, and the unconscious spectator had been taken into the hospital corridors to recover. Inside the theater, the wooden table was wiped down. Blood-stained cloths were gathered. Instruments were returned to their trays. To the surgeons and students present that day, the worst part of the event seemed to have passed. The accident had been shocking, yes, but surgery in the early 19th century was rarely clean or predictable. Injuries happened, patients screamed, blood spilled. These things were simply part of the profession. What most of the people in that hospital did not yet understand was that the real danger had not occurred in the moment of the knife. The real danger had already begun. It was invisible, silent, and slowly spreading through the wounds left behind. Because in the early 1800s, infection was the greatest killer in medicine. More patients died from infection than from the surgery itself, but doctors did not yet understand why. The idea that microscopic organisms could cause disease would not become widely accepted until decades later. At the time, physicians believed sickness came from something far less precise. They believed illness rose from bad air, a poisonous atmosphere called miasma. Rotting waste, dirty streets, stagnant water, all were thought to release invisible vapors that caused disease. If a patient died after surgery, doctors often blamed the environment, the weather, the patient's constitution, or simply misfortune. Rarely did they suspect the true cause: tiny living organisms, invisible to the naked eye, entering open wounds and multiplying rapidly inside the body. The concept would have sounded almost unbelievable to most surgeons of the era, yet every hospital ward was filled with evidence of it. Because even when operations were performed perfectly, patients often died days later. The pattern was tragically common. A surgery would appear successful. The wound would be closed. The patient might even sit up in bed the following day. Then slowly, something would begin to change. The skin around the wound would redden. Swelling would appear. The area would grow warm to the touch. Then the fever would begin. Doctors often described the smell before anything else, a sickening odor drifting from the wound, sweet, rotting, unmistakable. It was the scent of infection, a warning that the body was losing its battle. In many hospitals of the time, entire wards developed a reputation for death. Patients admitted for relatively minor procedures sometimes left in coffins. Surgeons watched helplessly as infections spread from patient to patient, sometimes through wounds, sometimes through surgical instruments, sometimes through nothing more than a doctor's own unwashed hands. But no one yet understood the connection. Even worse, hospitals themselves had become breeding grounds for disease. Beds were placed close together. Patients with open wounds lay only feet apart. Doctors moved from one patient to another without washing their hands. The same instruments were used again and again, often with only the most basic cleaning between procedures. A quick rinse in water, a wipe on a cloth, and then the blade returned to work. To modern ears, it sounds horrifying, but at the time it was normal, because the greatest threat in surgery was believed to be blood loss or shock, not infection. So when Robert Liston's operation ended that day, most people in the theater were concerned with what had already happened: the severed fingers, the fainting spectator, the violent chaos of the moment. But the wounds created during that operation had already become entry points for something far more dangerous, something no one in the room could see. The patient who had lost his leg was placed in a recovery ward. His body had endured tremendous trauma. The pain alone could have been fatal, but for now he survived. Assistants monitored his breathing. Bandages were changed. Doctors checked for signs of bleeding. At first, there may have been hope. Many patients lived through amputations. Some even recovered fully. But the first days after surgery were always uncertain, because that was when infection most often appeared. Meanwhile, the assistant whose fingers had been accidentally severed was treated in another part of the hospital. His wound had been wrapped tightly. The bleeding had slowed, but the damage was severe. Without modern surgical repair, there was little doctors could do beyond cleaning the wound and waiting to see whether the body could heal on its own, or whether infection would take hold. Injuries like his were particularly dangerous. The hand contains countless small bones, tendons, and blood vessels. Any wound in that area could become a gateway for disease. Still, the doctors treating him likely hoped for the best. They had seen many injuries like this before. Some patients survived, others did not. In medicine of the early 19th century, uncertainty was constant. Then there was the third man connected to the operation, the elderly spectator who had fainted during the chaos. At first, his condition seemed the least serious. He had not been cut, not physically. When he regained consciousness, he reportedly insisted that he had been stabbed during the surgery. Witnesses tried to reassure him. They explained that the blood he had seen was from the assistant's injury, not his own. But fear can be powerful, and the human mind sometimes reacts to terror in ways that the body cannot easily recover from. The man remained shaken. Doctors believed he had suffered from extreme shock. Today, we might recognize it as a stress-induced medical crisis, but in that era, understanding of such conditions was limited. All three men were now recovering in different parts of the hospital, their fates unfolding quietly over the following days. At first, the hospital returned to its routine. Other surgeries were performed. Patients arrived and departed. Students continued their studies. But slowly, signs of trouble began to appear. The patient who had lost his leg developed a fever. At first, it was mild, not unusual after a traumatic operation, but the swelling around the wound began to grow worse. The bandages darkened with discharge. The smell became impossible to ignore. Doctors recognized the signs immediately: infection. Without antiseptics, without antibiotics, there was almost nothing they could do. They cleaned the wound as best they could, changed the bandages, tried to keep the patient comfortable. But once infection entered the bloodstream, death often followed quickly. Within days, the man who had survived the knife succumbed to the silent killer that haunted every surgical ward. Meanwhile, the assistant's condition also began to worsen. At first, his wound appeared stable, but then swelling began to spread up his arm. The skin darkened. Fever set in. Infections in the bloodstream moved rapidly through the body. Doctors watched helplessly as his strength faded. Within a short time, he too was dead. 2 lives lost, both connected to the same moment of surgical chaos. But the story was not finished, because the third man, the spectator who had fainted in terror, would soon meet a fate that made the story almost unbelievable. His body had not been cut, his skin had not been broken, yet the shock of the moment had left a mark deeper than anyone realized. In the days after the operation, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors described him as weak, agitated, overcome by fear. Whether from heart failure, stress, or something doctors of the era could not explain, he died shortly afterwards. 3 men, 3 deaths, all linked to the same operation. And when the story spread through medical circles, the number itself became the centerpiece of the legend. 1 surgery, 3 fatalities, a mortality rate of 300%. It sounded almost impossible, almost absurd, but it perfectly captured the brutal reality of medicine in that era. A time when surgeons worked with extraordinary courage, but without the knowledge needed to truly control the dangers they faced. And long after the knives were cleaned and the operating theater emptied, the invisible killers of infection continued their quiet work, claiming lives, teaching harsh lessons, and reminding the world that in early medicine, the blade was rarely the deadliest part of surgery. Chapter 6: Death by Shock. By the time the first 2 deaths were confirmed, the hospital had already begun whispering about the operation. The patient who had lost his leg was gone. The assistant whose fingers had been severed had followed soon after. 2 deaths connected to 1 surgery. Even in the brutal world of early 19th century medicine, that was unusual. But what happened next would transform the story from tragedy into legend. Because there was still the third man, the spectator, the man who had not been cut, the man who had only watched. At first, no one believed his condition was serious. When he had collapsed in the operating theater, the cause seemed obvious: shock. In an era before modern psychology, before doctors fully understood the relationship between the mind and the body, the word shock was used in many different ways. Sometimes it meant physical trauma. Sometimes it meant emotional terror. And sometimes it meant a mysterious collapse doctors could not easily explain. The elderly man had been standing near the operating table when the accident occurred. He had seen the knife flash, seen the assistant's hand sliced open, seen the sudden spray of blood. In the chaos of that moment, he believed the blade had struck him as well. For a brief instant, he was convinced he had been fatally wounded. And the human body can react violently to that kind of fear. Witnesses later described how the man's face drained of color. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor before anyone could reach him. To the surgeons and students present, the reaction was not entirely surprising. People fainted during operations all the time. The combination of blood, screams, and violence was simply too much for some observers. Students witnessing their first surgery often passed out. Even seasoned doctors occasionally had to step outside the theater for fresh air. So when the elderly spectator collapsed, the assumption was simple: he had fainted, nothing more. Hospital staff carried him out of the theater and laid him on a nearby bench in the corridor.
Cold water was splashed on his face. Someone loosened the collar of his coat. Gradually, his breathing steadied. But when he regained consciousness, something about his reaction troubled the doctors. He was frightened, deeply frightened. He kept insisting that he had been stabbed, that the surgeon's knife had cut him during the operation. Those around him tried to reassure him. They explained what had actually happened. The blade had struck the assistant's hand. The blood he had seen belonged to someone else. He had not been injured, not physically.
But the man struggled to accept that explanation. His mind remained trapped in the moment of panic. In his memory, the blade had come toward him, the blood had sprayed, and he had felt certain that death was coming. Doctors of the era did not yet understand how powerful such fear could be. Today, we know that extreme stress can trigger catastrophic reactions in the body. Heart attacks, strokes, sudden cardiovascular collapse. But in the early 19th century, such events were mysterious. Doctors could observe them, but they could rarely explain them. So the man was sent home, believed to be shaken but otherwise unharmed. Yet in the days that followed, his condition deteriorated. Those who visited him later described the man who seemed deeply unsettled. He remained convinced that he had nearly died during the surgery. Sleep became difficult. His heart raced constantly. He complained of weakness and dizziness. Physicians examining him could find no visible injury, no wound, no obvious disease, but something inside his body had changed. The terror he experienced in that operating theater had not simply faded away, it had taken root. The human nervous system is built to respond to danger. When faced with a sudden threat, the body releases a surge of chemicals designed to help a person survive. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, the heart beats faster, blood pressure rises, muscles tense. In moments of real danger, these reactions can save a life. But when the stress is overwhelming or prolonged, the same reaction can become deadly. Extreme fear can push the body beyond its limits. Even today, doctors occasionally document cases where sudden shock triggers fatal heart rhythm disturbances. In the 19th century, without modern medical knowledge, such deaths seemed almost inexplicable. And that is exactly what happened to the spectator. Within days of witnessing the operation, his health collapsed completely. Accounts vary slightly depending on the source, but the outcome remains consistent. The man died. No wound, no infection, no surgical injury, just the lingering effects of terror. And when the news reached the hospital, the story of the operation took on an entirely new meaning, because now there were 3 deaths connected to a single surgery: the patient, the assistant, and the spectator. 3 separate tragedies, all tied to the same moment when the knife had slipped. At first, the story spread quietly through the hospital. Doctors discussed it in hushed tones. Students repeated the details to one another in disbelief. But it did not stay confined to that building for long. Medical communities in the 19th century were tightly connected. Students traveled between cities to study under famous surgeons. Letters were exchanged. Stories were told and retold in lecture halls. And the tale of Robert Liston's disastrous operation began to circulate. With each retelling, the detail that captured people's attention was the number: 3 deaths, from one surgery. Eventually, someone calculated the statistic in a way that made the story unforgettable. The mortality rate of the operation was not 100%, not 200%, but 300%. It sounded almost impossible, a dark mathematical joke from a brutal era of medicine. And like many remarkable stories, it grew with time. Some versions of the tale became exaggerated, others simplified the details, but the core of the story remained the same. A legendary surgeon, a lightning-fast amputation, a moment of chaos, and 3 men who died as a result. For Robert Liston himself, the incident was undoubtedly troubling, but it did not destroy his career. In fact, Liston would later become one of the most important figures in the transition toward modern surgical practices. When anesthesia was first introduced in the 1840s, Liston was among the earliest surgeons in Britain to adopt it. He even performed one of the first operations in Europe using ether as an anesthetic. For the first time in surgical history, a patient could be rendered unconscious during an operation. The screams that once filled operating theaters could finally be silenced. Precision could replace speed. But the story of the 300% mortality operation never disappeared. It remained a strange footnote in the long history of medicine, a cautionary tale repeated in textbooks and lectures, not because it represented the typical outcome of surgery, but because it captured something deeper. It revealed just how dangerous surgery had once been, not only for patients, but for everyone involved. And it reminded future generations of doctors that medicine, for all its progress, had been built on centuries of painful lessons. Lessons learned through failure, through tragedy, and sometimes through stories that sounded almost too strange to be true. The operation itself had lasted less than a minute, but its consequences would echo through medical history for nearly 200 years. 3 men, 1 knife, and a moment of terror so powerful that even a man who had not been touched by the blade could not escape its reach. It was the final piece of the story, the last step toward a statistic that seemed almost impossible. A surgery remembered not for the skill of the surgeon, but for the strange and tragic number it left behind. 300% mortality. Chapter 7. Was the story true? Stories like this have a way of surviving long after the people involved are gone. They travel through time the way whispers travel through dark hallways, quietly at first, then louder, then repeated so often that the line between fact and legend begins to blur. The story of the surgeon who achieved a 300% mortality rate is one of those stories. For nearly 2 centuries, it has appeared in medical lectures, history books, and curious collections of strange historical events. Students hear it during their first weeks of medical school. Doctors repeat it when discussing the brutal realities of early surgery. And listeners react the same way almost every time, with disbelief. 3 deaths from one operation. It sounds impossible, almost like a dark joke created to illustrate how dangerous surgery once was. But the story has a name attached to it. Robert Liston, a real surgeon, a well-documented figure in 19th century medicine, which raises an important question. Did it actually happen? Or has the story grown larger with every retelling, transforming a real event into something closer to myth? To answer that question, historians have spent decades examining the evidence. And like many stories from the distant past, the truth is not perfectly clear, because the early 19th century was not an era of perfect medical records. Hospitals did not always document operations in detail. Some reports were written years later. Others were passed down through students who had heard the story secondhand. And memories, especially dramatic ones, have a way of changing over time. But what historians do know about Robert Liston paints a picture that makes the story feel at least possible. Liston was very real, and his reputation for speed was legendary. Accounts from students and colleagues consistently describe him as one of the fastest surgeons of his era. Amputations that took other doctors several minutes were sometimes completed by Liston in less than 30 seconds. His style was bold, direct, and sometimes aggressive. Observers described his movements as confident to the point of intimidation. He believed hesitation was dangerous, and in the brutal world of pre-anesthetic surgery, many patients owed their survival to surgeons who worked quickly. But speed also carried risks. Instruments moved fast.
Assistants worked close to the surgeon's hands. Patients struggled violently during procedures. In such an environment, accidents were not unheard of. Even highly skilled surgeons occasionally injured assistants or themselves during operations. Medical journals from the era contain scattered references to surgical mishaps, knives slipping, tools breaking, unexpected complications arising in the middle of procedures. So the idea that Liston might accidentally have cut an assistant during a hurried amputation is not impossible. In fact, it fits the realities of the time. The second part of the story, the assistant dying later from infection, is also tragically believable. As we've already seen, infection was the silent killer of 19th century hospitals. Even minor wounds could become deadly. Without antiseptic practices, bacteria spread easily through surgical wards. Doctors moved from patient to patient without washing their hands. Instruments were reused repeatedly, and hospital environments often became breeding grounds for disease. So if an assistant had suffered a deep wound during surgery, the risk of infection would have been extremely high. The patient dying after the amputation is also unsurprising. Mortality rates for amputations in the early 19th century were often staggering. In some hospitals, nearly half of all patients who underwent amputations died from infection, blood loss, or shock. Surviving such a procedure was far from guaranteed. But the third death, the spectator who died from shock, that is the part of the story that raises the most questions. Some historians believe this element may have been exaggerated over time. Perhaps the man fainted and later recovered. Perhaps he became ill from unrelated causes. Or perhaps the details were altered as the story spread from one group of students to another. Stories passed down orally have a tendency to become more dramatic with every retelling. Yet even this strange detail is not entirely impossible. Medical records from the 19th century describe cases of people dying suddenly after intense emotional shock. The human body can react violently to extreme fear. Sudden stress can disrupt heart rhythms, trigger strokes, or cause cardiovascular collapse. Even today, doctors occasionally encounter conditions such as stress-induced cardiomyopathy, sometimes called broken heart syndrome. It occurs when extreme emotional shock temporarily weakens the heart. In rare cases, it can be fatal.
So while the exact circumstances surrounding the spectator's death may remain uncertain, the possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the story so fascinating. It exists somewhere between documented history and medical folklore, not completely proven, not completely disproven, a legend rooted in a very real time and place. But there is another important detail historians point out when discussing the story. Robert Liston himself was not an incompetent surgeon. Far from it. Despite the famous tale of the disastrous operation, Liston was widely respected by his peers. He was known not only for speed, but also for innovation and skill. He performed hundreds of successful surgeries during his career, and he played an important role in one of the greatest turning points in medical history, the introduction of anesthesia. In December of 1846, news reached Europe of a revolutionary discovery made in the United States. A dentist named William Morton had successfully used ether to render a patient unconscious during surgery. For the first time in history, doctors had a reliable way to eliminate pain during operations. The implications were enormous. If patients could be kept unconscious, surgeons would no longer need to rush. Precision could replace speed. Careful technique could replace frantic cutting. Many surgeons were skeptical at first, but Robert Liston was not. In fact, he quickly recognized the potential of the new discovery. Only days after hearing about the American demonstration, Liston performed one of the first operations in Europe using ether anesthesia. As the patient drifted into unconsciousness, Liston reportedly turned to the gathered audience and declared, "This Yankee dodge beats mesmerism hollow." It was a moment that marked the beginning of a new era in surgery. From that point forward, the operating theater would slowly transform. Patients would no longer scream in agony. Surgeons could work carefully and methodically, and the brutal race against pain that had defined earlier medicine would finally begin to fade. In many ways, Liston helped usher surgery out of its most chaotic era, which makes the story of the 300% mortality operation even more curious, because it places one of history's most capable surgeons at the center of one of medicine's strangest disasters. Was it real? Perhaps. Was it exaggerated? Possibly. But whether every detail is perfectly accurate or not, the story continues to survive for a reason, because it captures something essential about the time in which it occurred. An era when medicine was advancing rapidly, yet still shadowed by ignorance and danger. An era when surgeons possessed remarkable skill but lacked the scientific knowledge needed to control infection. An era when a single operation could turn chaotic in seconds, and when even the most confident surgeon could not always control the outcome. The legend of Robert Liston's disastrous operation reminds us that history is not always neat or predictable. Sometimes it is messy, strange, and unsettling. But those strange stories often reveal deeper truths. Truths about how medicine evolved, about how knowledge was slowly earned through trial and error, and about how far the modern world has come from the days when surgery meant speed, courage, and a very real gamble with death. And that brings us to the final chapter of this story, because the legend of Robert Liston's disastrous operation is not just a curiosity from the past. It is also a reminder of something remarkable: how medicine transformed itself, how science slowly replaced guesswork, and how the terrifying world of early surgery eventually gave way to something safer, something cleaner, something far more hopeful. But those changes did not come easily.
They came through decades of discovery and the hard lessons learned from tragedies like this one.
Chapter 8: The Birth of Modern Surgery. For most of human history, surgery was something people feared almost as much as the illness itself. The knife was a last resort, a desperate measure taken only when death seemed otherwise certain. The pain was unbearable, the risk of infection was enormous, and even the most skilled surgeons worked under conditions that today would seem unimaginable. Crowded theaters, unwashed instruments, hands stained from previous operations. In those early operating rooms, bravery mattered as much as skill. Patients needed courage to endure the pain. Surgeons needed courage to perform procedures that could easily end in tragedy. And yet, slowly, quietly, something began to change. Not all at once, not overnight, but piece by piece, discovery by discovery, the brutal world of early surgery began to transform. The first great shift came with a single extraordinary idea: the idea that pain itself could be turned off. For thousands of years, doctors had searched for ways to dull pain during surgery. Some used alcohol, others used opium or herbal mixtures. A few experimented with hypnotic techniques. But none of these methods could truly eliminate the agony of the knife. Patients remained awake, fully aware, and every cut was felt. That reality changed in the middle of the 19th century. In 1846, a dentist in Boston performed a public demonstration that would reshape medicine forever. He administered a gas called ether to a patient before performing a surgical procedure. The patient fell into a deep sleep, and when the surgery was over, he felt nothing. The news spread across the world with astonishing speed. For surgeons who had spent their entire careers racing against the clock to minimize suffering, the idea seemed almost miraculous. No more screaming, no more violent struggling on the operating table, no more frantic attempts to finish an operation before pain overwhelmed the patient. Among the surgeons who heard about this discovery was Robert Liston, the same man whose speed had made him famous, the same surgeon whose knife had once moved so quickly that it created one of the strangest stories in medical history. But Liston was not a man trapped in the past. When news of ether anesthesia reached London, he immediately recognized its importance. Within weeks, he arranged to perform one of the first operations in Europe using the new method. On December 21, 1846, inside a London hospital, a patient was brought into the operating room. But this time, something was different. Before the knife appeared, the patient inhaled ether through a simple device. Gradually, the patient drifted into unconsciousness. The room grew quiet. There were no screams, no desperate attempts to hold the patient down. For the first time, a surgeon could work without the chaos that had defined every operation before. Liston began the procedure, calmly, carefully, and when it was finished, the patient woke without any memory of pain. Witnesses in the room reportedly stood in stunned silence. After years of watching patients suffer through unimaginable agony, they had just witnessed something revolutionary. Liston himself reportedly turned to the audience and said with dry humor, "This Yankee dodge beats mesmerism hollow." It was a moment that marked the beginning of a new era. But anesthesia solved only one of surgery's great problems. Pain had been conquered, infection had not.
Even with patients asleep during operations, the invisible killers that haunted 19th-century hospitals were still waiting. Open wounds still invited bacteria, hospital wards still spread disease, and surgeons still lacked the knowledge needed to stop it. That knowledge would come from another revolutionary idea, one that would face fierce resistance before it was finally accepted. In the 1860s, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister began studying the emerging scientific theories about microorganisms. Scientists had begun to suspect that tiny, invisible life forms might exist all around us. Creatures too small to see with the naked eye, creatures capable of causing decay and possibly disease. Lister wondered if these microorganisms might be responsible for the infections that plagued surgical patients. If germs were entering wounds during operations, perhaps there was a way to stop them. His solution was simple: cleanliness. But not just ordinary cleanliness, chemical sterilization. Lister began using a substance called carbolic acid to clean surgical instruments, wash wounds, and disinfect the air around operating tables. The results were astonishing. Patients who would almost certainly have died from infection began surviving. Amputation mortality rates dropped dramatically. Wounds healed without the terrible smell of rot that had once filled hospital wards. Yet, despite this success, many doctors resisted Lister's ideas. The suggestion that surgeons themselves might be spreading disease was difficult for many to accept. Some dismissed the theory entirely. Others considered the new procedures unnecessary or inconvenient. But over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Hospitals that adopted antiseptic practices saw far fewer deaths. Surgeons who ignored them continued to lose patients. Gradually, the medical world changed.
Doctors began washing their hands before operations. Instruments were sterilized with chemicals or heat. Operating rooms were cleaned regularly. What had once been chaotic, blood-stained environments slowly transformed into controlled medical spaces. By the late 19th century, surgery had entered an entirely new age. The combination of anesthesia and antiseptic techniques made procedures safer than ever before. Surgeons no longer needed to race against the patient's screams. They could work slowly, carefully, methodically. Complex operations that once seemed impossible became achievable. Internal organs could be repaired. Bones could be set with precision. Entire new fields of medicine began to emerge. The operating theater itself changed as well. The wooden galleries filled with curious spectators gradually disappeared. Surgery became more private, more controlled, more focused on the patient rather than the audience. Bright lights replaced dim windows. Sterile gowns replaced blood-stained coats. Gloves were introduced to protect both doctors and patients. What had once resembled a brutal performance slowly evolved into something far more precise, a science. But none of these advancements erased the long history that came before. The early surgeons who worked without anesthesia or antiseptics had done the best they could with the knowledge available to them. They operated in an era when science was still uncovering the most basic truths about the human body. Their mistakes were sometimes tragic, their successes sometimes miraculous, and their experiences laid the foundation for the medicine we know today.
Stories like the legendary 300% mortality operation remind us just how dangerous surgery once was, but they also remind us how far medicine has come. Today, millions of surgeries are performed across the world every year. Heart transplants, brain surgeries, delicate procedures guided by robotic instruments and microscopic cameras, operations that once would have seemed like magic. Patients drift into peaceful sleep before the first incision. Surgeons operate in sterile environments with tools designed to minimize even the smallest risk. And when the procedure is finished, many patients walk out of the hospital days later, alive, healed, saved. It is easy to take these miracles for granted, but they were built on centuries of discovery, on countless experiments.
And on the lessons learned from a time when surgery was far more dangerous, a time when speed mattered more than precision, a time when infection lurked in every wound, a time when even the most skilled surgeon could not always prevent disaster. And perhaps that is why the strange story of Robert Liston's disastrous operation continues to fascinate people today, because it captures a moment from the very edge of medical history, a moment just before everything began to change, before anesthesia silenced the screams, before antiseptics defeated infection, before surgery transformed from a desperate gamble into one of the greatest achievements of modern science. The knife is still used today, but the world surrounding it has been transformed, and the brutal operating theaters of the past now exist only in stories. Stories that remind us of where medicine began and how far it has traveled since.
Chapter 9. Lessons from the Blood-Stained Past. History rarely moves forward in clean, perfect steps. More often, it moves through confusion, through mistakes, through moments when people do the best they can with the knowledge they have and still fall short. The story of the operation that supposedly reached a 300% mortality rate is not just a strange anecdote from the past. It is a window into a world that feels almost impossible to imagine today. A world where surgery was loud, bloody, and uncertain. A world where doctors possessed courage and skill, but lacked the scientific understanding that modern medicine now depends upon. When we look back at stories like this one, it is tempting to judge the past harshly, to ask how surgeons could possibly operate without washing their hands, how hospitals could reuse instruments coated in blood, how doctors could perform amputations while patients screamed in agony. But history is rarely that simple. Every generation works with the knowledge available at the time, and for centuries, medicine advanced slowly, piece by piece, discovery by discovery. The surgeons of the early 19th century were not careless. They were pioneers standing at the edge of the unknown. They faced injuries and diseases that could not be cured with medicine alone. Broken bones, crushed limbs, infections spreading rapidly through the body. Without surgical intervention, many of these patients would have died anyway. So surgeons took risks. They used the tools they had, and they learned from every success and every failure. In that sense, even the most tragic stories played a role in the evolution of medicine. Every patient lost to infection raised new questions. Every mysterious death forced doctors to reconsider what they thought they knew. Slowly, painfully, knowledge began to grow.
The discovery of anesthesia allowed surgeons to slow down. The discovery of antiseptic techniques revealed the hidden dangers of infection. Later advances in microbiology finally confirmed what pioneers like Joseph Lister had suspected all along. Tiny organisms, bacteria, were responsible for many of the infections that had once seemed mysterious and unstoppable. With that knowledge came new methods: sterilization, disinfectants, and clean surgical environments. Each breakthrough reduced the dangers that had once made surgery so terrifying, and each breakthrough was built on the lessons of the past. The blood-stained operating theaters of the 19th century may seem distant now, but they played an essential role in shaping the medicine we rely on today. Every modern hospital carries echoes of those early struggles. The sterile gloves surgeons wear, the disinfected instruments, the carefully controlled operating rooms, all of these practices exist because earlier generations discovered, often through tragedy, how important they truly were. Even the idea of patient safety itself grew from those lessons. In the past, surgery focused almost entirely on the skill of the surgeon, but over time, medicine began to understand that survival depended on far more than a steady hand. Clean environments, scientific understanding, careful preparation, teamwork, all of these factors now shape modern surgical practice. The transformation has been extraordinary. Procedures that once carried a 50% mortality rate are now considered routine. Operations that once required lightning-fast amputations are now replaced with delicate repairs that preserve limbs and restore function. In many cases, surgeons can even operate using tiny instruments guided by cameras no larger than a coin. But none of these advancements erase the past, and perhaps they should not, because remembering the past helps us understand how fragile progress can be. The story of Robert Liston and the legendary 300% mortality operation may never be fully confirmed. Some historians believe it happened exactly as described. Others suspect parts of the story were exaggerated over time, but the details matter less than the lesson it carries. That surgery once existed in a world where the margin between success and disaster was incredibly thin, where one slip of the knife could change multiple lives, where infection waited quietly behind every wound, and where even the most respected surgeons could not always control the outcome. It reminds us that modern medicine did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, through decades of observation, through experimentation, through countless doctors and scientists who refused to accept the limits of what medicine once was. Their discoveries transformed surgery from something feared into something trusted. Today, millions of operations are performed safely every year around the world. Heart surgery, organ transplants. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Progress rarely comes easily. It is often earned through mistakes, through questions, through the courage to look at failure and ask how things can be done better. The surgeons of the past worked in darkness compared to what we know today, yet their efforts helped illuminate the path forward. And because of that, the operating rooms of the modern world look very different from the theaters where Robert Liston once stood with knife in hand. Cleaner, quieter, safer. The screams that once echoed through those rooms have been replaced by calm voices and careful precision. The dangers that once haunted every wound have been pushed back by science and knowledge. But the past still lingers in stories. Stories preserved in medical history, stories repeated in classrooms and lecture halls, stories that remind us where medicine began and how far it has come. The blood-stained past may feel distant now, yet it remains an important part of the story, because every life saved today carries a small piece of the lessons learned back then. Lessons written not just in textbooks, but in the hard-earned history of medicine itself. History has a strange way of hiding its most unsettling stories. Not always in secret vaults or locked archives, but in the quiet corners of textbooks, in the footnotes of medical journals, in the whispered anecdotes passed from teacher to student, generation after generation. Stories that sound almost too bizarre to believe. And yet, they happened in a world that was very real. A world where surgery meant courage, where patients faced the knife fully awake, and where even the most skilled doctors stood on uncertain ground, surrounded by dangers they did not yet understand. Tonight, we stepped into that world, a crowded operating theater in the 19th century London, a surgeon whose speed made him legendary, a moment when a blade moved just a little too fast, and the strange chain of events that followed. A patient lost to infection, an assistant caught in the path of a hurried knife, and a frightened spectator whose body could not withstand the shock of what he had witnessed. 3 lives, 1 operation, and a number so unusual that it has echoed through medical history ever since. A mortality rate of 300%. Whether every detail of the story unfolded exactly as it has been told, we may never know for certain, but the legend remains, not just because it is strange, but because it reminds us of how far medicine has come. From blood-stained wooden tables to sterile operating rooms, from frantic amputations to delicate procedures guided by cameras and robotic instruments, from an era where speed was survival to an age where precision saves lives. The world of surgery today would feel almost miraculous to the doctors of the 19th century, and yet their struggles laid the foundation for everything that came after. Their risks, their failures, their determination to push forward even when the path ahead was unclear, all of it helped shape the medicine we rely on today. And that is why stories like this one deserve to be remembered, not only for their shock or curiosity, but for the lessons they carry with them. Because the past is not just a place filled with strange events. It is the long road that brought us here. And here, inside the story vault, buried truths, there are many more stories waiting in the dark. Forgotten experiments, unbelievable moments in history, mysteries that still raise questions centuries later. If you enjoy exploring the darker and stranger corners of the past, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories from the Story Vault, Buried Truths. Every week, we unlock another story history tried to leave behind. And if there's a strange historical mystery, a forgotten event, or a dark piece of history you'd like to hear explored, leave it in the comments down below.
Your suggestion might be the next story we open inside the vault, because some of the most fascinating stories in history are the ones people rarely talk about, the ones buried under time, the ones waiting quietly to be rediscovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay watchful, and remember, history is not just written in grand victories and famous names. Sometimes it's written in strange accidents, in whispered legends, and in the lessons learned from moments the world almost forgot. And here in the Story Vault, we make sure those stories are never lost. Also, just a small piece of friendly advice before we close the vault tonight. If you ever hear a surgeon look at a room full of people and say, "Time me, gentlemen," you might want to take 2 steps back. Actually, make it 10. Good night, and we'll see you next time when we unlock another story from the Story Vault, Buried Truths.